Well, my story of becoming a photographer is quite kind of long and elongated really, but I first got into photography when my dad gave me his old Pentax 35mm when I was about 15, and I used to roam around Brighton taking pictures of graffiti and the pier and the parks and people, kind of street photography mainly. And then I started at university, I started working for the student paper, and I also did an evening class, a City and Guilds evening class. And that's when I really started thinking about photography as a possible career in my future. A long-term project is often based on something I might read in a novel, some literature. It can sometimes come out of a poem. I'm quite heavily influenced by film, so often it will come from an idea from watching a movie or a certain style of cinematography. But my long-term projects are always very research-based, so I'll often spend months just looking into the project, trying to research where I need to go. I don't just go out straight away with my camera. It's much more kind of thought-based, and I'll be thinking for many months about how to approach the subject matter. But I feel that I get all my influences from different kind of creative outlets, whether it's literature, it's film, it's poetry, as I said, it's cinema. But often it could come from a line in a poem, it could come from one scene in a film, and that will really make me begin to think and get the ball rolling in terms of how can I tell this story through stills, and how can I start to build a narrative around this story. Ex-Voto is a 5-year project in total, and it began because I was very much interested in escaping London really, and religion had never been part of my upbringing at all. Ex-Voto is really about the connection between humanity, person and faith. And I decided on a bit of a whim really that I would go to Lourdes, which is a very, very well-known pilgrimage site in the south of France. And I kind of bundled off there not really knowing what to expect with no plans. And I was immediately struck by the kind of contemplative nature of Lourdes, by the interaction between the pilgrims who went there, the volunteers, and also the very visibly sick people who visited there. I then obviously started researching the background into Lourdes, like why it was important to these people, why people of such strong faith were drawn to it, and also the kind of allegedly miraculous healing properties of Lourdes. So I spent many kind of visits there initially, and then I started to expand the project, and I went to other pilgrimage sites, including Ballyverney in Ireland and also Grabarka in Poland. But again, it started really out of a film, because I'd seen a film by a female director called Jessica Hausner called Lourdes, and I was immediately kind of compelled to go there, because it was like these people in this pilgrimage site were really stuck in time. There was a real timelessness to them, and their energy was so kind of calm yet considered, and it just looked like somewhere that I really wanted to explore further. So I'm currently working on a documentary film, which is at the moment called Mother Vera. And this is very interesting for me because I'd never really thought about working in moving image. I've very much always been a stills photographer. So although I've been influenced heavily by film and cinematography, it wasn't something I ever thought I would do myself. But when I was working on my long-term project about Christian pilgrimage sites, which is called Ex-Voto, I have the book here, I met an Orthodox nun from Belarus called Vera, and she had this incredibly kind of powerful effect on me. She was probably the most kind of deeply spiritual person I've ever encountered in my life. And when I took the photo of her, I remember feeling her incredibly kind of strong and spiritual presence almost through the camera. It was quite a strange experience. But this kind of serendipitous encounter really led to me beginning to think about making a film. And that partly came out of the Sony World Photography of the Year award, because when I won that award, I was given a grant, which I was lucky enough to get a grant and some Sony equipment, and I had to make new work. So I thought, well, why don't I begin to explore the life of this nun, Vera? And I actually went to visit her initially at her convent in Belarus. And this then became, again, a kind of 4 or 5 year journey, whereby we're now at the stage, I'm co-directing it with my friend Cecile. We're actually about to start the edit because we've now finished filming. But it's been a really kind of extraordinary journey where we've spent a lot of time with her in the convent in Belarus, and also this incredible connection she has with horses there, and also the men on the farm. There's a whole community of men who are really on the kind of edge of society in Belarus. So it's all about the interaction, her past, her interaction with the men, with the horses, and the whole kind of strength of the community there. But that all came out of this portrait. So this is the original portrait I took of Vera, where I was in Grabarka in Poland, and that's when I first met her. And this led to a much, much longer and kind of more unexpected journey than I could ever imagine. I think all my work is really about exploring things for myself as well. So something like tackling the subject of faith, again, this is almost something that has never been part of my life at all. You know, I never went to church when I was young. I was brought up in a pretty left-wing kind of atheist family, really. But I'm always drawn to almost things that are opposite to my own life and things that are almost the antithesis of what I'm very comfortable with. I've always been a very curious person, so I always want to learn and educate myself. And that's partly why when I embarked on the project Ex-Voto, I actually also did an MA at SOAS in the anthropology of pilgrimage, because I felt it was really important as somewhat a kind of outsider to really try and understand the motivation of the pilgrims and why people found these places so deeply spiritual and so personally important to them. I think with my project Ex-Voto, it was really about trying to capture this sense of the connection between faith and nature and how these are very much entwined. So in the project Ex-Voto, I was photographing pilgrims. So I was doing these large format, very considered, very kind of still portraits of the pilgrims. I was also photographing the kind of sacred landscapes and the sacred sites. And then I was photographing the ex-votos themselves, which are the objects that people leave behind as a sign of devotion. So these can be anything from a small kind of twig in the shape of a cross that's been left on a rock, or it could be a photograph, you know, hidden in a tree. These very small gestures that were incredibly significant for the people who left them behind. But I think the most important thing for me in my work is that even if these people are from a completely different society, a completely different culture, I always really want to try and portray them. It's very important to me that everyone I photographed is portrayed with a deep amount of kind of respect and sensitivity. And that's why it's so crucial to me that I try and learn as much about the subject matter before I embark on these projects. The way I plan and prepare for my projects is really through my research. So for instance, with Ex-Voto, I researched every photographer that had ever been there that I could find. There were photographers like, you know, Cartier-Bresson, Giacomelli. There are very kind of significant and important photographers who had been there previously. And of course, what you don't want to do is just do exactly the same as someone else. It's about having your kind of spin on it or your take on it. And I was aware when I went to Lourdes that this was somewhere that had been documented very, very heavily in the past, but it was important to me that I did it my way. So although the research is very important in terms of other photographers' work, you're not trying to imitate that or duplicate that. Also, my research, as I've mentioned, you know, I watched a lot of cinema, so there were films about Lourdes and about the pilgrim experience that really kind of educated me about it. It's the same with the documentary feature film Vera that I'm making at the moment. You know, I've watched a lot of directors, Eastern European directors and Russian directors whose work I really admired, like Tarkovsky, who also is a brilliant photographer. So I'm really trying to immerse myself in the world as much as possible before I actually go there. It's very important to me that I try and educate myself and learn as much about my subjects before I actually turn up at the kind of location. So my research is quite multi-layered, I would say, but it's a really crucial part of the overall project and the overall experience. So often when I'm planning a trip, I won't know exactly what to expect until I get there. So my trips are often not months and months. I mean, there's a practical reason for that as well, because simply I can't afford to just go away for months and months on projects, much as I would love to, but I've got boring things to consider in London, like mortgages and bills and things like that. So I'll normally block out a certain amount of time for a kind of initial trip that can also act as a kind of recce, maybe a week or so. I'm always making notes, and that's really important to me. I learnt that partly when I did my MA as well, because I wrote my dissertation about Lourdes, and a lot of my dissertation was about very heavy kind of ethnographic description and observation. So I would sit just making notes on my own for a long time. So I do spend a lot of time on my own on these long-term projects. Sometimes I bring an assistant. So for instance, with Ex-Voto, they're the practicalities of having to bring equipment, having to kind of deal with people in different languages. So I was very lucky that the assistant I had for Ex-Voto is fluent in French and Spanish and Italian. And a lot of the pilgrims in Lourdes were from these countries. So that was essential. And it's also really important for me. It can be very lonely sometimes, photography. You know, I do spend a lot of time kind of wandering, exploring with my camera, but it's really nice to have someone else there for some of the trip that you can talk through ideas with, but some kind of moral support and guidance as well to really give you that kind of confidence that you need sometimes. The recent project, Lost Summer, which was all taken over 12 weeks from June to August 2020. And this was a project really born out of the pandemic. So obviously we're all having a very tough time, particularly in the creative industries. Work had stopped. I couldn't go abroad to work on projects in progress that involve travel. So I started thinking about what I could do in terms of creating work closer to home. I had several friends who had teenagers who were finding things really difficult because obviously their exams were cancelled, school had ended very abruptly, they really didn't know what the future held. And I'd been talking to my friends and they'd been, you know, discussing how many of their teenagers had just been stuck in their rooms, they weren't able to see their friends, and they were disappointed also about missing their proms. So all this kind of, these rites of passage had just really come to a standstill. So I started thinking about how I could document this, how I could really show what these young people were going through, but show them also to be very kind of dignified and actually resilient, because a lot of them were very mature in the way they were dealing with this. So I began to photograph teenagers in my local neighbourhood, dressed up in what they would have worn to prom. So this was my idea, that I would photograph local teenagers really dressed up for kind of the prom that never happened, if you liked. So I started with some friends of friends, and then the kind of word spread a little bit, and I began to photograph teenagers in their parks, in their backyards and gardens if they had them. It was very important to me that it became very kind of democratic as a project. So obviously I needed it to reflect the diversity of the neighbourhood that I live in North London. But I also didn't want people to make judgments about these teenagers' kind of socio-economic backgrounds, their class. I really didn't want that to be relevant. And that's why I chose to photograph them almost in these kind of democratic spaces that we can all access. And the first one I took was Jack. So if you can see Jack there, that was the first portrait I took for this project. I then started to get into a kind of rhythm of working, and I ended up taking 44 projects. Drew is another one of my favourites. Sorry, not projects. I ended up taking 44 portraits of teenagers over the course of 12 weeks. And it was brilliant for me because it gave me this motivation to keep thinking, to keep making work. I was shooting again in black and white on my large format camera. This is Jamila, who's also one of my teens. And I love getting to know them. Like, teenagers are hilarious, but also they were incredibly kind of mature. They were dealing with the whole situation with such kind of strength and resilience that really actually surprised me. A lot of them were being incredibly rational about what had happened and were trying to plan for the future as much as they could. And I loved having this moment with them. I would actually often spend a couple of hours kind of getting to know them, and then we would discuss the backdrops. But I wanted them very much to be almost kind of framed by the natural environment. So that's why a lot of them, like this portrait of Mimi, you know, it's the kind of ivy and the trees in her garden. And then you have people like, let me find another one, Ronnie, who kind of turned up in his suit, and we went to the local park in Tottenham. So it was really about trying to capture this particular moment in time, but also something about the very kind of real way that they were dealing with what was a very, very difficult situation. And the project I ended up calling Lost Summer because it seemed for me to really encapsulate the time that we were all going through and the difficulties associated with that. And this was self-published in November. So when I started Ex-Voto, which I think was in 2014 now, I began it partly because I was getting a little bit disillusioned with photography, and I was really worried that I was beginning to fall out of love with photography, which was really sad for me because it had been such a huge part of my life. I think with the commercial work, not finding the time for my personal work, I was finding it very hard to kind of strike a balance. So I actually made this kind of conscious decision to really invest more in my long-term personal projects, whether that was kind of emotional investment, psychological investment, financial investment. I just felt that this was the direction that I really wanted to go in. And that's when I began Ex-Voto. So this was really my first major long-term project that I committed to over a number of years. So before Ex-Voto, I had done personal projects that had always been important to me, but I'd never really given them the time and the space and the commitment that they needed to develop into something kind of significant. So it felt like a big moment for me when I kind of made that decision. But for me, Ex-Voto was a very personal project. It was a very kind of quiet project. It was something that I just kept working on. I kept revisiting these pilgrimage sites. I never really thought about the life of the project after I'd finished it. And it wasn't something that I certainly didn't make the work because I wanted the exposure. I certainly didn't make the work because, I felt it would be that significant to other people. I really didn't know how people would respond to the work. It just felt very meaningful for me, and I made it in the way that felt very kind of natural to me. That was the most important thing, to kind of trust my own instincts. So up until that point, when I was working on Ex-Voto, there were certain competitions that I had entered before. I wasn't really entering loads of photography competitions, and I decided actually for the first time to enter the Sony. And that's when I suppose the project really got major exposure, because I was lucky enough to win the Sony World Photographer of the Year award. And that came with a big exhibition at Somerset House and a lot of prize money and a lot of press and publicity. And I was quite shocked, because I just felt that this was a project that I'd worked on, yes, very kind of in my own world, really. I didn't really expect other people to respond to it in the way that I did, in the way that they did. So the kind of reaction to the project was quite a surprise, but obviously very lovely. And actually I realised that people connected with the work. You didn't need to be particularly spiritual. You certainly didn't need to be religious to connect with the work, but they would see something in the images, whether it was a kind of silence or a stillness or a contemplation. And that was really important to me, that people were able to see things in the images that I had seen when I was taking the photographs. So the exposure from the Sony was incredible, and it really took my kind of work and I guess my career to another level, but it was never anything that I could ever have really expected or contemplated or even thought about. When I was making the work, I was very much in the moment. I was very committed to the project, and I was just trying to really tell the stories of these pilgrims, but tell them in the way that I experienced it when I was in these pilgrimage sites. So the film work that I'm doing at the moment is currently called Mother Vera. It's a feature-length film based on the life of an Orthodox nun in Belarus called Vera, who I actually met when I first started working on the Ex-Voto project. And it was her portrait that became one of the most significant of the series. So at the moment, film work I thought photography projects took a long time, but film projects seem to take even longer. So it's been a real labour of love. I'm co-directing it with a very good friend and assistant called Cecile Embleton. So we're a tiny team, but we're a very kind of hard-working and committed team, if you like. And as we've been working on the film, we've obviously been developing kind of our own relationship with Vera, really. So as her life has changed and as we've got to know her more deeply and on a different kind of level, the film has kind of shifted somewhat. But it's still very much based on my original style of photography for Ex-Voto. So the film is all in black and white again. It's quite slow in some ways, it's quite still, it's very photographic in feel, which was very important to me. So there's definitely a kind of continuation of style there, and the aesthetic is really an extension of what I created when I made the work Ex-Voto. So we're now at the stage with the film where we finished filming. So it's been about 3 years now of filming in Belarus, which has been a very interesting experience, in lovely, beautiful summers and harsh, bleak winters. So we've kind of covered all the seasons there. And also more recently in France, because there's been a big development in the story, which has meant that Vera is actually no longer in Belarus, which has been an unexpected but exciting twist for the film. So I've been spending some time in France recently filming there. We were lucky to get funding from Sundance, so the Sundance Institute, for the film, which has really helped us. But obviously with film projects and with photography projects, it's a kind of ongoing struggle to find funding, really. So we're at the stage where we're looking at working with different editors, but we really need the money to go ahead with that. All the film has been shot on Sony equipment, which has been brilliant because it's so lightweight, it's very discreet, it's very silent. You know, we're often filming at 3 a.m. in kind of silent services in the convent, so it's essential to us that the equipment isn't loud, it's not clunky. So it's been perfect for that. And it's very exciting to work with film. It's not something I've done before, but it felt like the right thing to do, given that the project of Vera was so important to the overall kind of structure, really, of Ex-Voto. My most recent photographic project is called Gli Isolani, which is the islanders in Italian. And I have been visiting islands in Italy, up from Venice, the kind of Venetian islands in the lagoon there, all the way down to Sicily and also Sardinia on the west. And I'm very much interested, as I've said before, a lot of my work is about exploring kind of things that aren't really part of my life at all. So I became interested in these very rich traditions and kind of rituals and what it meant to be an islander in Italy in terms of the identity of Italians. Although a lot of the islanders do not consider themselves Italian, so like the Sardinians and the Sicilians. And I began to research, again, look very kind of in depth at the different regions of these islands and the significance of the costumes and the rituals that took place over various festivities on these islands. So I've been taking mostly portraits of these kind of characters. A lot of them are based on good and evil. A lot of the rituals are to do with the land, the farm, kind of the importance of the natural landscape. And a lot of the festivities are incredibly kind of debauched in some ways. There's a lot of drinking going on, there's a lot of partying, but I actually photograph them again in this very kind of still way outside of the festivals themselves. Here are some pages actually from my sketchbook. So when I work on long-term projects, I'm always making notes. I have sketchbooks. I put out tear-outs that are really kind of interesting to me into these sketchbooks. And this is part of a big prize called the Prix Elysée. So I was one of the 8 nominees for the Prix Elysée. And what was great about this prize is we were actually given money to work on projects in progress. And then the publication includes a lot about the process and the research that goes into these projects. So as I said, the project is about kind of faith and ritual and tradition in Italy. It's called Gli Isolani, the islanders. And as you can see, it's again kind of in this very kind of still black and white style, shot on large format. And then if I just turn the page here, you can see some of the portraits that I've done recently. These were shot in Sicily. And these are based on, very, very deep-rooted traditions in these very tiny communities in islands in Sicily. And someone described them as almost being like characters you feel like you've met in your imagination. Like some of them are quite surreal looking, some of them are quite strange and weird looking, but there's something I love about this strangeness that I feel it's almost like you've met these people before, and sometimes in dreams and sometimes in nightmares. But I like that idea of they're lurking somewhere in your imagination. I also, when I did my research, I was reading a book about Sicily, in fact, and I found this quote that had actually been etched onto a bell in an old chapel in Sicily. And I felt that it really summed up what I was trying to say with the project. And it just says, I cast out demons, I calm the storms, I call to the living, I cry for the dead. And I felt that was very significant in terms of what I was trying to say with the project about the kind of death of some of these rituals, about mortality, about the relationship with nature and the land, and also about good and evil. So this is very much a project in progress, but I'm hoping it will be a book and an exhibition next year. So it's quite interesting, I think, how I met Vera and also how I meet and interact with my subjects. So Vera really became the most central character and the portrait in the whole Ex-Voto series. And when I'm thinking about who I'm photographing, it's not always easy. There's not really a tick list of what I want from someone. With the Ex-Voto project, I was certainly looking for a timelessness, a kind of otherworldliness, So there might be something about someone's bone structure or what they're wearing, or even the way they carry themselves, or their gait that might, or their deportment, you know, that might kind of attract me to them in terms of taking their photograph. And I'll always be very kind of sensitive when I approach someone. I explain what I'm doing with my camera and I ask, would it be okay to make a portrait of you? I tend to say make rather than take. I feel it's a bit kind of gentler and people are able to engage more with that. With Vera, it was interesting because I had spotted her from quite a distance. She was incredibly striking, very kind of luminous and very beautiful. She had her orthodox kind of outfit on, so her headdress, a black headdress, you could just see the oval of her face, and very long black cloak. As soon as I saw her, I remember saying to Cecile, my assistant, wow, she's amazing. She's amazing. Let's ask if we can take her photograph. Of course, we were in Poland at the time, in Grabárka, a pilgrimage site. And I never know how someone's going to react to me asking to make a portrait of them. You know, sometimes you have to be prepared for people to say no, of course, and I have to respect that. But I was really hoping that Vera would say yes, because I'd spotted her and I just thought she had this incredible kind of presence. So actually Cecile approached her and said, we're doing this project, do you speak English? And she did speak English. We're doing this project and would you be happy to be photographed for the project? And she's actually a real kind of performer, and she was like, of course, ladies. And she kind of walked over and I had this space in the forest with this beautiful kind of dappled light. And we took her to this space and I was able to take her portrait. So photography wasn't always a really obvious career choice for me. I come from a very academic family. Not that they're not creative, they are creative in their own way, but it wasn't like, you know, my dad was a potter and my mum was a photographer and my great-grandpa was a cinematographer. They're all fairly academic, so it wasn't really something I considered in terms of my future career. I studied English literature and communications at Leeds University. That I think actually really does help now with the way I approach my projects, because I do use a lot of reference to literature, I do a lot of research, and I think these are all kind of somewhere embedded in my brain, and I think that they influence how I begin to think about and approach a project, and also really think about storytelling and narrative, because of course that's very important, especially for my long-term projects. It wasn't until I left university, I actually moved to New York to work for a film production company, because I thought that was initially the industry that I wanted to get into. I found that to be a really terrible and kind of disappointing experience, but I spent a lot of time wandering around New York, taking photographs with a black and white film in a 35mm Pentax. And actually, it's not something I would probably do now, but at the time I just thought, why don't I try and think about doing photography more professionally? Time Out had just launched their Time Out Guide to New York, and I actually put together, looking back, quite a basic black and white portfolio of prints, sent it off to them. This was before even mobiles really and emails, sent it in the post, and then I got a phone call, a landline call, to say, would you be interested in taking all of our photographs for the new Time Out Guide to New York? So kind of essentially travel photography, because we're about to launch that. And I was very young, I was in my early 20s, and that was obviously an amazing opportunity. It was my first professional commission. I was shooting on black and white film and colour transparency, so completely pre-digital. And I just got to learn about organisation, about independence, about you know, how I would plan for shoots. I had to be incredibly kind of disciplined with my time. I was given huge shoot lists, and I had to work through these lists over a number of weeks. So it was actually several months that it took me to complete this job. But that then led to me travelling to many cities in North America and Europe. And I continued to work for Time Out on their travel guides for many years, really. And it was really good grounding in photography, because it taught me all these different kind of ways of working and how to deal with people, how to make the best of difficult situations, as well as how to, you know, obviously compose and use light well and get the best out of any situation. So it was really good kind of training. And then when I came back to London, that's when I studied more formally. For the first time I studied photography at that level, and I did a postgraduate course at Central St Martin's School of Art, which really then gave me kind of a great grounding and basis to try and become more of a kind of full-time photographer. So I shoot on film for most of my personal work, for the main reason being that it just makes me really think in a different way. So I almost find that I have quite a kind of cerebral approach to my projects. And with film, obviously you're working in a much slower way. It's much more considered. Sometimes on a personal job, I might shoot even 1,000 frames in a day. When I'm shooting on film, I'll shoot between 1 frame and maybe a maximum of 10. So it's a very, very different way of thinking. It's a very, very different way of working. And it also really suits a lot of my subject matters. So if I'm talking about or working with projects that are involving themes such as faith and spirituality and tradition and ritual, it somehow feels much more fitting to shoot that on film. So that's what I choose to do. I also still really love the anticipation of not knowing what you're going to get. And sometimes that can be terrifying. Like I've just got back from shooting in Sardinia and I was convinced that all the film was going to be blank. It was going to be a complete disaster. It was going to get fogged by the X-ray machines. So of course there's an element of kind of luck and chance involved in some ways, but that also to me makes shooting on film really exciting. So I would consider most of my work to be kind of classed as fine art documentary. My portraits are not staged in that I'm photographing real people in real environments that they would actually be in. So I don't tend to photograph people and take them to kind of artificial environments or locations they wouldn't already be in. So in that sense, they're quite documentary. But it's really important to me that I think very carefully about the backgrounds. So for instance, with Ex-Voto, it was important that the natural elements came through, the natural elements of the landscape. So I would deliberately kind of isolate the portraits and the pilgrims that I was photographing with the river in the background or lakes in the background or kind of framed by the trees to really emphasize the connection between spirituality, faith and the landscape. So that was very important to me. For the Lost Summer series about the teens whose proms had been cancelled, at first I thought maybe I would shoot them in their bedrooms, but then I felt that you would start making perhaps judgments about their families, the class kind of backgrounds they were from, and I didn't want you to do that. So again, I used the natural landscape. So I really used what was already available to me. I would use kind of the trees and leaves to almost frame them, to almost kind of produce a studio, like an outdoor studio setting, but in the available landscape. So for me, it's really about trying to connect the viewer with the person who I photographed. And to do that, I keep it very simple in terms of the background. And I'm quite kind of clear and precise in terms of setting up a portrait. So I don't have any other people in the background. There's kind of no distractions. The emphasis is very, very much on the connection between me and the person I'm photographing. So when I'm shooting on film, particularly when I'm using large format, it's very expensive. So that's a consideration when I'm shooting. I can't just shoot frame after frame after frame. So that is always a kind of consideration in my head. So I have to be very, very disciplined. Sometimes I will set up a whole shot. It'll take me maybe even half an hour to set up the camera. For instance, if I'm doing a landscape, and then at the last minute, I think, you know what? I don't think this is going to work. The light's not quite right. The composition and framing isn't quite right. So I'll kind of abandon it almost. Other times when I'm shooting a portrait, I'll do very, very few shots. I think the portrait I took of Vera from Ex-Voto, I maybe did 6 plates, which is the most I've ever done of a person when I'm working on a long-term project. I'll generally do between 1 and 4 plates. So it makes it very, very I have to be very, very precise with the way I think, how I set up the shot, the exact kind of stance I want the person in. For me, most of my portraits are about trying to find the kind of inner someone, if that makes sense. So yes, they might be very kind of beautiful, or they might be very striking from the outside, but particularly with these big kind of themes I'm trying to tackle, it's about trying to connect with the person inside. So I will give minimum direction. I will always think very carefully about the backgrounds, and some of them are maybe slightly solemn, but I really hope that my portraits are very kind of thoughtful. I want them to be very thoughtful in the way they represent people, but also thoughtful in terms of the viewer's connection to the people I'm photographing. Okay, so tips for other photographers. It really starts with an idea. So for me, the most important thing is the idea. I then figure out, often over a number of years, how to really kind of portray and communicate what I'm trying to say. And what I'm trying to say is often the thing that is most difficult to kind of tackle So for instance, with my Ex-Voto project, I actually initially started shooting that in colour or medium format for about 2 years, and that really wasn't working. So I kept revisiting the project, keep revisiting the idea, and in the end it kind of evolved into something very different in terms of me shooting in large format in black and white, and that allowed me to express what I was trying to say. So I think ideas are key, but also having patience. That would be my kind of second tip, is to really not rush things. So my strongest projects have taken 5 years. They haven't always worked at the beginning. In fact, they've never worked at the beginning, really. It's a question of me learning and figuring out what is working and not, and why that is. And again, really what I'm trying to say through the work. And I feel with something like Ex-Voto, because I'm understanding a subject matter that is quite alien to me, I'm learning all the time, I'm educating myself, and that's not something that can be rushed. So I think really taking your time around projects and ideas is really essential. I would say another thing is to trust your instincts. When I'm photographing in locations, when I want to shoot people, I have to grab those chances when I can. Or if I see someone who I think instinctually they could make a really strong portrait, I have to approach them then, or else the moment's really gone. So it's about trusting your instincts in terms of, you could be photographing landscapes, you could be photographing people, but it's something that draws you to someone or something for a particular reason. So I think trusting your instincts, even in the commercial world as well, is really important. I would also say, don't worry if you think that idea or that subject has been done before. We're living in a world where photography has been around for, way over a century now, and in different forms anyway. And everyone's kind of done something. So you could think of the most obscure, tribe or village on the planet and pretty much guarantee that a photographer will have already been there. For instance, with Ex-Voto, I knew that many photographers had been to Lourdes, but it's about your own interpretation. It's about figuring out what you're trying to say and telling that story through your own eyes and through your very personal kind of lens and experience, really. So I wouldn't worry if you see other work that is similar in some way, or if subject matters have already been covered, because that will happen, but it's about doing it your way and making it very individual to yourself. I would say also it's really great to get advice in terms of edits from other people. I think when you're so immersed in a project yourself, you can become very almost over familiar with the subject matters. I know with Ex-Voto, I became particularly attached to certain images and portraits because, for instance, I'd had a brilliant time when I met 84-year-old Joe Kelly in Ireland, and I wanted him to be in the book. But it wasn't until I spoke to the book designer and got other people's opinions that I realised that although he was a kind of personal favourite of mine, that doesn't always make the strongest edit in terms of sequencing work. So I think any advice from friends and colleagues, they don't have to be experts in the photo world, but it's really valuable to get that insight from other people and other people's opinions, so you're not just reliant on yourself to do the edit and the sequencing. So I think my kind of overriding advice for anyone wanting to get into photography, whether it's commercial photography or art photography, really is that it has to be the only thing you can ever imagine yourself doing. It's so highly competitive, it's so difficult, it's so challenging to actually kind of make a living essentially from photography that you have to be incredibly passionate about it. I occasionally meet people who are not sure what they want to do, students or graduates, and they think they might want to go into photography. But I would say you have to believe so strongly in it being the only thing you can do. I couldn't really imagine myself doing anything else. And for that reason, I've kind of carried on, and I've, it kind of evolved my work, and I'm very determined and very driven, but I also think you have to be incredibly committed to being a photographer and to really telling stories as well, particularly if you're doing personal projects. That has to be key, working out what you're trying to say and how to say it. I get a lot of inspiration from photo books. As you can see, I've got quite a big collection behind me, and they're all types of photography: 35mm, digital, colour, black and white, covering many different themes. But these are some of my kind of current favourites, I suppose. And ultimately, the photographers who influenced me most are fairly traditional in their methods and their process. So most of them are working in black and white. A lot of them are working on large format in the way that I do for my personal projects. But I'll often, if I'm feeling a bit, kind of not exactly down, but if I'm feeling unsure about projects or I'm feeling a bit stuck with something, I'll just kind of reference some of these books and I'll look through them again and I'll feel, you know, re-inspired often. I also find it really useful to look at the essays. So a lot of these photo books have short essays, maybe by curators, by editors, by the photographer themselves, that give the project some context. And I find that really, really useful as well for understanding on a deeper level many of these photography projects. So if I just go through a few, Judith Joy Ross is one of my current favourites, and she did this very beautiful book of people who visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, DC. And this is one of my favourite images from the book of this young boy. I just love that he looks kind of quite lost, but it's also, there's a kind of innocence and an urgency to his expression. And of course you've got the beautiful, she shoots on a 10:8 camera, which is even bigger than the camera I have. So it's large format with a 10:8" negative. So the clarity is absolutely stunning. And just the way she's captured people at this very kind of, in this very poignant moment while they're maybe remembering and memorializing, but at this particular kind of political juncture, I think is really interesting. So that's one of my favorites. A very classic photographer, or very well-known photographer, whose work I think is quite a clear influence on me, is August Sander, who did photographs of many workers, often in the 20s and 30s. Let me try and find one of my favorites. So he did a lot of pictures of workers, he did different classes, he did families as well. And again, shooting on a kind of old-fashioned style camera in quite a kind of straight way. This is a very beautiful picture of Painter's Wife. That's one of my favorites. And just the tones are very beautiful. The way he, again, you almost feel like you're kind of communicating directly with the person he's photographing. And I just love the kind of formality to them, but also there's a familiarity there, which I find very striking. So his work has been a big influence on me. A photographer I actually only discovered relatively recently is called Andrea Modica, and she did this beautiful book about Treadwell, and she particularly built a very close relationship with the young girl there in America. And they're kind of documentary really, but they're very beautifully and sensitively observed. So you have these kind of tableaus that are either portraits or they're still lifes. But there's also always something quite kind of strange and mysterious happening in the frame, as you can see from these, for instance. And she's become quite an influence on me recently. I only really discovered her in the last couple of years, but she's someone whose work I really, really admire. And then finally, a recent discovery is a Swedish photographer called John Allender, and he did a series of portraits from 1910 to 1932. And he wasn't actually a photographer, well, he was, but he didn't consider himself to be a photographer. And he did these very beautiful, again, very kind of quiet and still images of people in his local village in Sweden. And they're all, again, you can see the kind of influence that I have from these, of the frames of the trees, the kind of beautiful, kind of diffused light. But there's also a sense of kind of intimacy there. I feel that you can really feel the connection between him and his subjects. So he's someone whose work I only found out about recently, and who certainly wasn't working to get any fame or attention or exposure. He worked on glass plates, which he then developed in his garden. And I think they're actually very kind of tender portraits, and they really speak of the community that he was very close to and that he was a part of. So that's another one of my current favourites. Okay, so this is the Sony A7R3, and we used this a lot when we were filming in Belarus, especially in the convent, when we had to be very quiet, very discreet. And obviously, as it's mirrorless, it's excellent because it's completely silent. So it was a kind of lifesaver in terms of filming in such a hushed environment, really. I tend to use fixed lenses because I quite like having to move towards or away from my subject. So I've never really been dependent on zoom lenses. My preference has always been fixed lenses, whether I'm working on film or in digital. So at the moment, one of my kind of favourite lenses is this 50mm 1.4. So it gives a very, very beautiful depth of field, which I use for stills and also for moving image. So a lot of the moving image, I'm retaining this particular depth of field as well, that really makes the subject kind of stand out. But really it's so kind of small and discreet that it's been brilliant for when we've been filming, as I said, particularly in this Orthodox convent in Belarus, where we've had to almost go kind of under the radar and remain as invisible as it is possible to be. So the Sony's been fantastic for working on the Vera film. I'm going to talk you through my large format kit, and I recently, well, a couple of years ago, invested in a Chamonix. So the actual structure of the camera is, it's a 5.4 camera, it's a large format camera, and you know, it's based on a very kind of old design, if you like, one of the earliest kind of cameras, but it's actually a modern camera. Before I got the Chamonix, I was using a Sinar, which is usually used for studio work. So it's a lot more heavy and cumbersome, and I realised that I kind of do my back in a bit if I was carrying around that endlessly like I normally do. So I invested in a field camera, which is a folding camera, which I'm going to show you now. So this is a Chamonix camera. It's pretty lightweight. So as you can see, it's pretty compact, really. It's got the ground glass on the back. So I would normally take it out like this. Check that's the right way around. Now I always have to use a tripod for this, for this work, because that's it. It is possible to use 5.4 handheld, and in fact it used to be used a lot for press, 5.4 cameras, but you know, they're not really designed to be handheld, and you would need to use a flash, and it's, you know, it's very kind of awkward to handhold. So because my portraits and my landscapes as well are very kind of considered and thought through, I need to use a tripod for every shot I do. So it folds out like that. This protects the ground glass on the back, so I take that off. And then these are the bellows. So really it's just a kind of light, tight box. It's very simple. There's not even a battery. You know, there's no settings on the camera. There's obviously no screens. It's completely basic and simple, really. It's in lots of ways it's photography in its simplest form. So I then secure the front. And depending on the subject, so if I'm doing a landscape, the bellows need to be closer together. If I want to view something very close up, the bellows need to be further apart. So this is what I usually use for most of my portraits, that setting. There's lots of spirit levels on it to check that it's straight. Now, I tend to only use one lens, and I use a 150mm Schneider, which is actually the equivalent to like a 35mm, 50mm lens. And 50mm has always been my favourite lens, really. So I've stuck to the equivalent, if you like, in large format. So that slots in there. Just need to make sure that's secure. I put these down to secure the lens in place. Let me check that. That generally needs to be up a little bit. That's it. Okay. There you go. So obviously I would normally be very, very precise about this, but I can check the spirit level on the back. Okay, so that's straightish. Then make sure it's all secure and in place. I then take the lens cap off and open the shutter, because in order to focus you need to have the lens as open and as wide as possible. So in order to focus, I focus on the ground glass on the back, which is here, and bearing in mind that what I see in the ground glass, everything is actually upside down and back to front, so that takes a little bit of adjusting and getting used to in terms of composing the shot. I would then get my loop out, which is like magnifier really on my neck. So let me pop that here. Okay. And then if I was setting up for a shot, make sure that's all straight. Obviously I would be spending a very long time making sure that's perfect. And then in order to focus, I put this cloth over my head. So the shutter's open, cloth goes over my head. So it's light tight, so I can see the screen, because if there's other light sources coming in, you can't see the ground glass. Okay, so I can see the screen. I can then move it around, let me focus. So I put the loop. So I look a bit strange sometimes, like a matador or a ghost or something. But I spend quite a lot of time under this cloak. So I would then focus it, make sure that's in focus. So go around the ground glass with the loop, checking all the corners, checking the composition is correct. Okay. Then it comes to the film plates. So the film is preloaded and it has to be loaded in complete darkness. So I have a changing tent that I use. And these holders only take 2 sheets, so 1 on each side. And what you tend to do is, if the film has yet to be exposed, you use the white side. And when you've exposed the film, you use the black side to indicate that it's been exposed. Because although it's a very simple way of working, there's actually quite a lot of things that can go wrong working in this way. So for instance, it's really easy to double expose, for instance. It's really easy to think you've exposed a shot when you haven't, or to open the plate and expose the film with the shutter still open. So there's lots of kind of easy mistakes you can make that are quite costly in terms of it being annoying, and also financially, because the film's quite expensive. So I would set it all up like this. Say my subject is in front of me. I then, once that's all set up, it's in focus, I close that, I cock the shutter. Probably would normally be a little bit more stable, but that's okay. So I can just do a test one here. I often do a test one to check that the shutter is not stuck. So this is on 1/4 of a second at f5.6. So the shutter will be open for 1/4 of a second. Let's have a go. Yeah. Then for instance, 1/2 a second, that will be a longer exposure. So if it was a 1/2 a second exposure, that's a much longer exposure, you can hear it. So say that's all ready to go. Lens is closed, cock the shutter, put the film in, and I would always note down the number of each plate. So I have detailed notes showing the exposures for each plate that I take. So this would be this side. So I would put the film holder in, like so. Now the subject has to stay, if I'm doing a portrait, the subject has to stay very still. So any movement, especially if I've got the camera at 5.6, it's going to be out of focus. You'll lose the focus point. So I'm always talking to my subjects. I'm saying, you know, stay very composed, very, very focused. Just keep looking into the lens. And actually, because it's quite a kind of slow and meditative way of working, often they almost kind of lose themselves. They become very focused and very kind of connected to the lens. And I find that that helps in terms of working with my subjects. It's a different way of engaging with the subjects. And if I was taking a portrait, so it's all ready, take out the holder. I would generally stand to the side so they're not looking at me, so the focus is on the lens. And then with the shutter release or the cable, I would go like that. So that's the shot that's been taken. I then put the slide in, black side up, so I know that I've exposed it. Take it out, put a band on it, and then that's one sheet of film exposed and ready to go to the lab. So it's fairly simple, really. There's a lot to think about, even though it's very simple, and there's a lot of things that can go slightly wrong. So you have to be very invested in concentrating and being very patient and getting it just right before you actually take the shot itself. But I do find this way of working, it very much, as I said, kind of fits with my subjects. It's very aligned with how I want to work at the moment in this slow and considered and precise way. So this is the camera that I use really for all my major projects at the moment. Occasionally using colour film, but nearly always using black and white, large format sheet film. So there are loads of great classes coming up as part of the Women in the Industry programme by some really fantastic female photographers. So, you know, I'd really encourage you to look at some of those as well, and also be inspired by other photographers, and particularly female photographers working in the industry today. I really hope that some of you have found this interesting and perhaps inspiring, and can use some of what I've said to put towards your own photographic projects. Thanks so much to Wex Photographic and to Sony for supporting this work and bringing these masterclasses together. And there's loads of great other classes, behind the scenes masterclasses that you can view as part of the Women in Industry events that are happening to celebrate women in photography today.